Welcome back to another deep dive into the dark corners of Fallout lore, where the secrets of the old world still echo through the wasteland. Today, we are exploring a question that changes everything you thought you knew about pre-war America. What if the United States had never reorganized into the 13 Commonwealths? Let us begin this confession from the wasteland. I found my great-grandfather's driver's license yesterday buried in a footlocker beneath 3 feet of irradiated sand at what used to be the California-Nevada border checkpoint. It said State of California, on it not Southwest Commonwealth. The plastic was melted at the edges, the hologram faded, but those words were clear as day. State of California. I held it in my hand for an hour just staring because it meant something I bet never fully understood until that moment. The America that died in 2077 was more divided than the one that tried to survive. And I wonder every single day if we got it backwards. My name does not matter anymore. Names stopped mattering when the bombs fell. What matters is that I am a vault dweller born in Vault 21 underneath what used to be Las Vegas, and my history teacher, Miss Paulson, spent 6 years drilling into us the story of the 13 Commonwealths. She had this old holotape, scratchy and glitching, that showed the reorganization ceremony from 1969. I must have watched it 100 times. Men in suits standing in front of a new flag, 13 stars, arranged in a circle around one big star in the middle. The Commonwealth system, she said, was designed to streamline resource management, to make America stronger, to prepare us for the future that was coming. But here's what she never told us. Here is what I found in the ruins of the old Clark County Administration Building, in files that somehow survived 2 centuries of radiation and decay. The reorganization did not make us stronger. It made us manageable. It made us controllable. And when the bombs fell, it made us predictable. Every faction that rose from the ashes, every territory that claimed sovereignty, every border that got drawn in blood, they all followed those old Commonwealth lines. Like we could not imagine any other way to divide ourselves. Like the ghost of 1969 was still running the show. I have spent the last 3 years of my life tracing those lines across the Mojave. I have walked from Prim to Searchlight, from Boulder City to Nipton, mapping where the old Southwest Commonwealth ended and the rest began. And everywhere I go, I find the same thing, people still thinking in Commonwealth terms, even when they do not know what a Commonwealth is. The NCR calls itself the New California Republic, but the territory they claim follows the California Commonwealth boundaries almost exactly. The Legion draws its eastern border along what used to be the 4 states Commonwealth line. Even the Vegas Strip neutral ground run by robots and madmen sits right where 3 Commonwealth zones converged. It is like the whole country was programmed in 1969 and nobody ever bothered to write new code. Let me tell you what the world might have looked like without those Commonwealths. Let me tell you about the America that never was the one where 50 states stayed. 50 states where governors kept their power, where regional identities never got consolidated into 13 administrative blocks. Because I have done the research, I have run the numbers, I have talked to people who remember the old world through their grandparents' stories, and I can tell you with absolute certainty, we would have been a different kind of broken. Start with the basics. In our timeline, the one we are living in, the 13 Commonwealths were formed as an intermediary layer between state and federal government. The Massachusetts State House has a plaque that says the building was retired from active use in 1969 when the Commonwealths formed. Think about that. Think about what it means when a state capital loses its purpose because a new administrative structure has been imposed from above. The people of Massachusetts did not vote to become part of the New England Commonwealth. It just happened. Federal decrees signed and sealed, 50 stars becoming 13. Now imagine it did not happen. Imagine 1969 comes and goes, and California is still California, Nevada is still Nevada, all 50 states maintaining their individual sovereignty under the federal umbrella. How does the resource wars play out differently? Because that is the key question, isn't it? The resource wars of the 2050s and 2060s were when everything started falling apart, when oil ran out, when nations turned on each other, when America started eating itself from the inside. In our timeline, resource allocation during those wars was managed at the Commonwealth level. The Great Midwest Commonwealth controlled agriculture for half the country. The Southwest Commonwealth regulated water rights across 4 states. When Kansas needed food, they did not negotiate with their neighbors, they requisitioned it through Commonwealth channels. When Arizona fought California over Colorado River water, it was not state versus state, it was internal Commonwealth politics. The system created buffers, layers of bureaucracy that maybe slowed things down, maybe prevented 50 different state governments from going to war with each other, but maybe it also concentrated power in ways that made the system more brittle. Maybe it created 13 points of failure instead of 50 points of adaptation. I have found congressional records from 2076, just a year before the end, showing how Commonwealth delegates operated. They represented multiple states, sure, but they also centralized decision-making. When the Southwest Commonwealth made a trade deal with Texas, Commonwealth, 4 states on each side, were bound by agreements they did not individually negotiate. When food riots broke out in Montana in 2074, the Northern Commonwealth deployed troops from 3 other states to suppress them. State boundaries became suggestions. Commonwealth authority became absolute. Without that system, would the resource wars have triggered internal civil conflicts earlier? Would 50 state governments competing for dwindling resources have torn the country apart before China ever launched a missile? Or would the diversity of 50 different approaches to survival have created more resilience, more experimentation, more paths forward? I found a protest sign in an old Las Vegas museum preserved behind rad-proof glass. It was from 2075, 2 years before the end. Big block letters, states' rights, not Commonwealth might. Somebody resisted, somebody saw what was happening and pushed back. The sign was found in the wreckage of what used to be the Nevada state capitol in Carson City, along with evidence of a violent crackdown. Federal troops, Commonwealth authority, dissent crushed. That is our timeline. That is what happened when you tried to remember that Nevada was supposed to be Nevada, not just a subdivision of the Southwest Commonwealth. In a 50-state system, would that resistance have succeeded? Would states have maintained enough individual power to check federal overreach? Or would the chaos of 50 competing governments have made the crackdowns worse, made the military-industrial complex even more necessary, even more dominant? Let me talk about the military, because that is where things get really interesting. In our timeline, military organization by 2077 was built around Commonwealth structures. The Southwest Commonwealth Defense Force, the Great Midwest Commonwealth Guard. When America mobilized for the Anchorage reclamation, when we sent troops to Alaska to fight the Chinese, those forces were organized by Commonwealth. A soldier from California served alongside soldiers from Nevada and Hawaii because they were all Southwest Commonwealth troops. Unit cohesion shared identity, Commonwealth pride. Without Commonwealth's military organization would have defaulted to the old state National Guard system. California troops, Nevada troops, Montana troops, 50 different state militaries coordinated by federal command but maintaining state loyalty. Does that make the military more effective or less? Does state-level organization create stronger local ties and better morale? Or does it create 50 different tactical doctrines, 50 different supply chains, 50 different points of failure? I have talked to Brotherhood of Steel elders who served in the pre-war military. Not many left who remember, but the ones who do, they tell stories about Commonwealth loyalty, how soldiers from different states within the same Commonwealth would die for each other, how the bonds formed across state lines created something new. But they also talk about resentment about Texas Commonwealth troops refusing to cooperate with Northern Commonwealth forces, about how the reorganization created new tribal identities that sometimes helped and sometimes hurt. In a 50-state system, would pre-war military cohesion have been stronger or weaker? Would the old American identity, the one that predated Commonwealth reorganization, have held better under stress? Or would state nationalism have fractured the military into 50 competing forces incapable of unified action? Here is what keeps me up at night: the vaults. Vault-Tec's entire experimental program was organized by Commonwealth. I have accessed old Vault-Tec planning documents, classified files that survived in hermetically sealed underground archives. The experiments were not random. They were demographic studies, region-wide psychological testing. Vault 13 was a Southwest Commonwealth project designed to test how people from California, Nevada, and Hawaii would respond to isolation. Vault 76 in Appalachia was designed around New England and Columbia Commonwealth demographics. Every vault in a given Commonwealth was running variations on the same experimental themes, creating a controlled study across millions of test subjects. Without the Commonwealth system, Vault-Tec's experiment design would have been completely different. Maybe more randomized, maybe less coordinated, maybe distributed across 50 state-level demographics instead of 13 regional ones. Does that make the Vault program better or worse? Does it create more diverse data, or does it create chaos that makes the results useless? And since the vaults were never really about saving people, since they were always about preparing for some post-war future that the Enclave and their corporate backers had planned, does changing the experimental design change the post-war world? If you are still with me after hearing this, hit that like and subscribe button. I need to tell you about the Enclave because this is where the Commonwealth question gets truly twisted. The Enclave, the remnants of the pre-war United States government, the shadow government that survived on oil rigs and in bunkers while the rest of us burned, they claim legitimacy based on continuity of government. We were the federal government before the war, they say so. We are the legitimate government after the war. In a Commonwealth system, that claim is arguably stronger. They represented the layer above the Commonwealths, the unified federal authority that coordinated all 13 regions. They can point to the chain of command, the succession protocols, the constitutional authorities that put them in charge when the president evacuated to an oil rig instead of staying in Washington. But in a 50-state system without Commonwealths as an intermediary layer, the Enclave's claim to legitimacy becomes more complicated. Because if 50 states maintained more sovereignty, if governors retained more power, if state governments were more robust, then the Enclave becomes just one claimant among many. The governor of California, the governor of Texas, the governor of New York, they all have equally valid claims to represent governmental continuity in their regions. The Enclave cannot claim to be the only legitimate successor to federal authority if state authority remains strong enough to challenge them. Maybe that is why the Enclave was so brutal in our timeline. Maybe they knew their legitimacy was shaky even with the Commonwealth system backing them up, so they overcompensated with violence, with genocidal plans, with schemes to wipe out everyone who might question their authority. In a 50-state world without Commonwealth consolidation, making their federal claims seem natural, they might have fractured immediately. 13 different Enclave successor governments, each claiming to represent their region, each former Commonwealth becoming its own breakaway state with its own version of pre-war authority. That is the nightmare scenario, right? Not one enclave trying to genocide the wasteland, but 13 smaller enclaves each, with enough resources to be dangerous, but not enough to actually succeed at anything except making everyone else miserable. Or maybe it would have been better. Maybe smaller regional successor governments would have been forced to actually govern, to make deals to recognize the people they claim to rule instead of hiding on oil rigs and plotting extinction events. I have walked through what is left of the California coastline from the Boneyard up to the ruins of San Francisco, and everywhere I go, I see this same pattern: post-war factions drawing borders along pre-war Commonwealth lines. The new California Republic, which started as a farming settlement called Shady Sands, founded by Vault-15 survivors, named itself after the California Commonwealth, not the state of California. When they expanded, when they started incorporating other towns and forming a federation, they thought in Commonwealth terms. Their first 5 member states, Shady Sands, Los Angeles, Maxon, The Hub, and Dayglow, they all fall within the old California Commonwealth boundaries. Not the state boundaries, the Commonwealth ones. Aradesh and Tandi, the founders of the NCR, they grew up hearing about the Commonwealth system. Their parents, the original Vault-15 dwellers, they lived through the Commonwealth era. They knew California as part of a larger regional identity, not as a standalone state. So when they built something new, when they tried to create a government from the ashes, they unconsciously replicated the structure they had inherited. The NCR is shaped like a commonwealth because its founders could not imagine any other shape for a regional government to take. But what if Vault-15's founders had remembered California as a state with its own identity, its own boundaries, its own governmental traditions, stretching back to the gold rush? Would Shady Sands have become the capital of the new California state instead of the new California Republic? Would the political structure have been different? The expansion pattern altered, the relationship with neighbors reconfigured? I spent 2 months in the NCR capital before it was destroyed, before Shady Sands became a crater and a ghost story. I talked to old-timers who remembered President Tandi, who served for 52 years and shaped the republic into what it became. They told me about her vision, about how she wanted to rebuild the old world to restore democracy and rule of law and all those beautiful principles that died in nuclear fire. But when I asked them what the old world looked like in her mind, they always described it in Commonwealth terms. 13 regions coordinated federal authority, streamlined resource management. Nobody remembered or cared that there used to be 50 states with their own flags, their own governments, their own competing visions of what America should be. The Commonwealth system, implemented 108 years before the bombs fell, had erased the memory of what came before. Even people trying to rebuild American democracy were rebuilding the version that existed from 1969 to 2077, not the version that existed from 1776 to 1969. 2 centuries of state-based federalism forgotten, 1 century of Commonwealth consolidation remembered. That is the power of institutional memory. That is how deeply the reorganization scarred American consciousness. Let me tell you about trade routes, because economics tells you everything about how power actually flows. In the post-war wasteland, the major trade corridors all follow old Commonwealth commerce patterns. The Crimson Caravan, the biggest trading company in the West, runs routes that connect former California Commonwealth territories. Gunrunners, the major weapons manufacturer, distributes through old Southwest Commonwealth supply networks. Even the Raider tribes, the people who rejected civilization entirely, they set up their territories along Commonwealth borders because those were the natural choke points, the places where trade had always flowed. In a 50-state system, trade routes would have been more numerous, more diverse, more chaotic. Each state would have maintained its own economic relationships, its own tariff systems, its own commercial regulations. The interstate highway system would have connected 50 different economic zones instead of 13, creating a more complex web of trade relationships. Does that make the post-war economy better or worse? Does diversity of trade routes mean more resilience when civilization collapses, or does it mean more confusion, more conflict, more warlords fighting over smaller territories? I have mapped every major trade route in the Mojave and compared them to pre-war Commonwealth boundaries. The correlation is almost perfect. Traders follow the old roads, sure, but they also follow the old political logic. They think in terms of Commonwealth-sized territories of regional markets that span multiple former states. A 50-state economic system would have produced a different pattern: smaller markets, more local economies, less regional integration. Is that better for Reconstruction or worse? The NCR's economic success came partly from their ability to integrate multiple territories into a single market to leverage Commonwealth-scale economics. Without that model, without that inherited structure, would post-war governments have defaulted to city-states, to local autarky, to isolated communities too small to ever rebuild anything resembling civilization? Let me tell you about Caesar's Legion, because they are the dark mirror of the NCR, the faction that proves how deeply Commonwealth thinking infected everyone. Edward Sallow, the man who became Caesar, he was a follower of the apocalypse, an educated man who studied pre-war history. When he decided to build an empire to create a totalitarian slave state based on ancient Rome, he did not base its territorial organization on Roman provinces. He based it on American commonwealths. The Legion's eastern territories, the lands they control beyond the Colorado River, they are organized around the old four states Commonwealth and Texas Commonwealth boundaries. Caesar knew those borders. He understood that they represented natural geographic and demographic divisions. So, even though he was explicitly rejecting American values, rejecting democracy and freedom and everything the old world stood for, he still used American administrative geography, because that is how deeply the Commonwealth system was embedded in the landscape, in the cultural memory, in the basic assumptions about how to organize large territories. In a 50-state system, would Caesar have organized his legion differently? Would he have created 50 tributary states instead of regional governorships? Would the increased complexity of managing 50 different territories instead of a handful of Commonwealth-sized regions have made his empire more fragile, more vulnerable to rebellion and fracture? I asked a Legion deserter this question once, a man who had served as a frumentarius, one of their spies. He looked at me like I was crazy. The Legion works because it is simple, he said. Caesar controls the East, the NCR controls the West, and we fight over the middle. If there were 50 different territories instead of a few big ones, if every state had its own identity and its own government to remember, the whole system falls apart. You cannot build an empire on complexity. You build it on simple divisions, clear hierarchies, obvious territories. That is the thing about the Commonwealth system. It simplified America. It took 50 moving parts and condensed them into 13. It made the country easier to govern, yes, but it also made it easier to control, easier to dominate, easier for any faction with enough power to claim authority over huge swaths of territory without having to negotiate with dozens of smaller entities. I need to tell you about the Brotherhood of Steel because their entire expansion strategy was built around Commonwealth thinking. The Brotherhood emerged from a United States Army unit stationed at Mariposa military base in California, soldiers who survived the war and dedicated themselves to preserving technology. When they expanded eastward, when they established chapters across the wasteland, they organized around old Commonwealth military installations. The Mojave chapter, the Capital Wasteland chapter, the Commonwealth chapter. In Boston, they are all named after and located in former Commonwealth territories. Elder McNamara once told me before he was killed in the NCR War that the Brotherhood's chapter system was based on pre-war military organization. "We are preserving the chain of command," he said. "We are maintaining the structure that kept America's military functional." But that structure was Commonwealth-based. The Brotherhood did not create 50 state chapters, did not organize around old state National Guard armories. They followed Commonwealth military districts because that is what the pre-war records showed them. That is what their founders remembered. In a 50-state system, Brotherhood expansion would have looked completely different. More chapters, smaller territories, more localized control. Does that make them more effective at their mission of preserving technology, or does it spread them too thin, make them vulnerable to infighting and fragmentation? The Brotherhood's civil war between Elder Lion's faction in DC and the main chapter in California already showed how fragile their unity was. Multiply that tension across 50 state-based chapters instead of a handful of Commonwealth-based ones, and maybe the Brotherhood never survives as a coherent organization at all. If this story has kept you listening this far and you want more of these dark confessions from the wasteland, hit that like button. It really motivates me to create similar Fallout lores. I found something in an old Vault-Tec archive 6 months ago that changed everything I thought I knew about the Commonwealth system. It was a planning document from 2062, 15 years before the bombs fell, titled Regional Demographic Harmonization Through Administrative Consolidation. The language was bureaucratic, bloodless, but the implications were terrifying. Vault-Tec had lobbied the federal government to create the Commonwealth system specifically to make their vault experiments more effective. Think about it. If you want to run controlled experiments on human populations, you need controlled populations. 50 states with 50 different demographic profiles, 50 different political cultures, 50 different ways of responding to crisis. That is too many variables. But 13 Commonwealths, each one demographically engineered through decades of internal migration and economic policy to be relatively homogeneous, that is a scientist's dream. That is the perfect setup for comparing how different regional cultures respond to the same stressors. The document laid it out explicitly. The Southwest Commonwealth was engineered to have a particular ratio of urban to rural populations, a specific distribution of wealth and poverty, a controlled mix of ethnic and religious backgrounds. Same with every other Commonwealth. The federal government spent decades manipulating internal migration, offering tax incentives to move to certain regions, creating economic opportunities in some areas, while letting others decline, all to create 13 distinct demographic zones that could be studied, compared, analyzed. And then they built the vaults, distributed them across these engineered populations, and ran experiments designed to test how each demographic profile would respond to different scenarios. Isolation resource, scarcity, exposure to radiation, genetic modification, social control, every variable carefully calibrated against the Commonwealth demographics that Vault-Tec had helped engineer in the first place. In a 50-state system, that level of demographic control would have been impossible. States have constitutional protections, historical identities, local governments that resist federal manipulation. But Commonwealths were federal creations, administrative units that existed to serve federal purposes. They had no inherent rights, no deep cultural identities to protect them. They were from the beginning tools of federal policy, and Vault-Tec used them as tools of corporate experimentation. I think about my Vault 21 built under Las Vegas in the heart of the Southwest Commonwealth. Our experiment was gambling-based social organization, everything decided by games of chance. They wanted to see how a population conditioned by Nevada's casino culture would adapt to making all decisions through random chance. That experiment only made sense in Commonwealth terms in a demographic zone that had been engineered to value gambling and risk-taking and luck over planning and security. In a world where Nevada was still Nevada, still its own state with its own distinct identity, would Vault-Tec have designed the same experiment? Or would state-level demographic diversity have made their entire experimental program impossible to execute? Here is the question that haunts me. Did the Commonwealth system make us weaker or stronger when the bombs fell? I have spent 3 years researching this, traveling across the wastes, talking to survivors and their descendants, reading every pre-war document I can find. And the answer keeps changing depending on which angle I examine it from. On one hand, the Commonwealth system created regional resilience. When California got hit, the rest of the Southwest Commonwealth had established supply chains, mutual aid agreements, coordinated emergency response protocols. The same infrastructure that managed resource allocation during the resource wars became the framework for disaster response after nuclear war. Commonwealth-level emergency management meant that when one state collapsed, neighboring states in the same Commonwealth were already positioned to help, already had the legal and logistical structures in place to coordinate relief efforts. The NCR exists today partly because of that Commonwealth infrastructure. When Vault 15 opened and its residents founded Shady Sands, they did not build from nothing. They scavenged Commonwealth government buildings, used Commonwealth emergency supply caches, followed Commonwealth evacuation routes to find other survivors. The mutual aid networks that the Southwest Commonwealth had built over a century became the foundation for post-war cooperation. Without those networks, without that inherited structure, maybe Shady Sands stays isolated, stays small, never grows into the republic that briefly brought law and order back to California. But on the other hand, the Commonwealth system created single points of catastrophic failure. When a Commonwealth capital got hit, when the central administration vaporized in nuclear fire, the entire region lost coordination. I have found evidence that the Great Midwest Commonwealth, which controlled most of America's agricultural production, had its entire administrative apparatus in Chicago. One bomb and the coordination structure for feeding half the country disappeared. In a 50-state system, losing one state capital means you lose one state's coordination, but 49 others keep functioning. Losing one Commonwealth capital means you lose coordination for 4 or 5 states simultaneously. The starvation in the Midwest after the war, the complete collapse of agriculture that turned the breadbasket into a dead zone, that happened partly because Commonwealth centralization meant there was no backup, no redundancy. When Chicago burned, Kansas could not coordinate with Nebraska, Iowa could not coordinate with Missouri. The whole system seized up at once. I talked to a ghoul and gecko, one of the few people still alive who remembers the war itself. He was a Commonwealth agriculture coordinator stationed in Denver, part of the Great Midwest Commonwealth administration. He told me that in the hours after the bombs fell, when he realized Chicago was gone, he tried to establish contact with state-level agricultural offices, and he could not, because state-level agricultural offices had been disbanded decades earlier, consolidated into Commonwealth management. The expertise still existed, scattered across 5 states, but the organizational structure to utilize that expertise had been destroyed. If we had kept the state departments of agriculture running, he told me, his radiation-scarred face barely moving as he spoke, if every state had maintained its own coordination structure instead of feeding everything through Commonwealth offices, maybe we could have saved something. Maybe the Midwest does not become a dead zone, but we centralized everything, put all our eggs in a few baskets, and when those baskets vaporized, we had nothing left. In a 50-state system, you have 50 different agricultural departments, 50 different emergency management agencies, 50 different coordination centers. More redundancy, more resilience, more ability to adapt when parts of the system fail. But you also have more complexity, more potential for coordination failures, more risk that states prioritize their own survival over national cooperation. There is no clean answer. Every advantage of Commonwealth consolidation created a corresponding vulnerability. Every benefit of state-level diversity created a corresponding coordination problem. Let me tell you about the flag, because symbols matter more than we like to admit. The American flag changed in 1969 when the Commonwealths formed. 50 stars became 13, arranged in a circle around one central star, representing the Columbia Commonwealth, the seat of federal power. That flag flew over America for 108 years, from 1969 to 2077. It is the flag that most pre-war Americans would have recognized, the flag that hangs in vaults and ruins across the wasteland. But I have seen the old flag too, the 50-star version. I found one in a museum in Vault 4, preserved behind glass, and looking at it felt like seeing a ghost. 50 stars, each one representing a state, each state representing a sovereign entity that chose to join a union of equals. That is what the old flag meant. Voluntary association maintained sovereignty, United States plural, not singular. The 13-star flag told a different story. 13 administrative regions managed by federal authority, topped by one central star that represented the real power. Commonwealth system, singular, not plural, a fundamentally different vision of what America was supposed to be. In our timeline, that 13-star flag is what people remember. It is what the NCR's two-headed bear flag is based on, that same centralized symbolism, that same assumption that regions matter more than individual states. It is what the Enclave flies when they claim governmental authority. It is even what the Brotherhood of Steel sometimes uses when they want to invoke pre-war American identity. But what if the 50-star flag had remained? What if American identity in the years leading up to the war had stayed rooted in state sovereignty and the idea of diverse communities choosing to cooperate rather than administrative regions designed to be managed? Would post-war factions have organized differently? Would the symbolism of 50 equal stars have created a different political imagination, one that valued diversity and local control over regional consolidation and centralized authority? I wear a jacket I scavenged from a pre-war government building, and it has a California state flag patch on the shoulder. Not a Southwest Commonwealth insignia, a California flag. The bear and the star, the symbol of a state that existed for over 200 years before it became just another subdivision of a larger administrative unit. When people see it, they ask me what nation I represent. They do not recognize California as California. They recognize it as part of the Southwest Commonwealth, or as the core of NCR territory, or as a region on a map, but not as a state with its own history, its own identity, its own claim to existence, separate from whatever larger structure it was forced into. That is what the Commonwealth system did. It erased states from cultural memory. It made regions the basic unit of political imagination. And when the old world died, when we tried to build something new from the ashes, we could only imagine building it in regional terms because we had forgotten what it meant to think in state terms. I need to tell you something I have not told anyone before. I know who my great-grandfather was. The one whose driver's license I found, the one who lived in a world where California was still California. His name was Marcus Chen, and he was a state senator. California state senator representing Sacramento County, serving from 2071 to 2075. I found his office in the ruins of the old Capitol building, and I found his files and I found his notes from the last years before the war. He fought against the Commonwealth system, not publicly, not in ways that would get him arrested, but in the quiet ways that state politicians fought when federal authority had become too powerful to challenge directly. He introduced bills to restore state control over water rights, over agricultural policy, over emergency management. Every one of those bills died in committee, killed by Commonwealth administrators who had veto power over state legislation that interfered with regional coordination. In his private notes, written in the margins of failed legislative proposals, he documented the slow death of state sovereignty. How California's governor had become a ceremonial position by 2075. How real decisions were made by Southwest Commonwealth officials who answered to federal authorities in Washington. How the California state legislature had been reduced to managing local issues like road maintenance and school funding, while all the important stuff, all the questions about resources and security and economic policy got decided at the Commonwealth level. He saw what was coming. In a journal entry from April 2077, 6 months before the bombs fell, he wrote, "We consolidated power in the name of efficiency, and we lost the diversity that made us resilient. When the crisis comes, and it will come, we will all fail in the same way at the same time because we have all been forced into the same system. There is no backup plan because we destroyed all the alternatives." He was right. The crisis came. The bombs fell. And America failed in exactly the pattern the Commonwealth system had programmed us to fail in. 13 regional collapses instead of 50 state-level adaptations. 13 sets of identical emergency protocols that all broke down in identical ways. 13 parallel disasters with no diversity of response, no alternative approaches, no experimentation with different survival strategies. My great-grandfather died in the Sacramento Capitol building on October 23rd, 2077, probably still at his desk, still fighting for a version of California that had already ceased to exist. I found his skeleton there, still wearing a badge that said California State Senator, not Southwest Commonwealth Delegate, not Regional Administrator, State Senator. He held on to that identity even when it no longer meant anything, and I wonder every single day if he was fighting for something better or just refusing to adapt to reality. Would a 50-state system have survived the nuclear war any better, or would it have collapsed even faster, unable to coordinate, unable to share resources? 50 different governments all making 50 different mistakes. The NCR tried to rebuild federalism, tried to create a government based on democratic principles and rule of law, and they succeeded for a while. They created something that worked, that provided security and prosperity and hope to millions of people. But they also replicated the Commonwealth model, built their republic on the same centralized assumptions, made the same trade-offs between efficiency and resilience. And then Shady Sands got nuked. One bomb, one city, and the entire republic collapsed, just like the Commonwealth system collapsed when the regional capitals got hit, just like every centralized system collapses when you destroy the center. If the NCR had been built on a 50-state model, if power had been more distributed, if the capital had been less important, would one bomb have caused total systemic failure? I do not know. Nobody knows. We cannot run the experiment again. We cannot go back to 1969 and choose differently. All we can do is look at the world we have, the world the Commonwealth system created, and try to understand whether we are building on a foundation that was always cracked or whether we are just repeating mistakes because we cannot imagine alternatives. Here is what I do know. Post-war factions have been trapped in Commonwealth thinking for 200 years. The NCR, the Legion, the Brotherhood, the Enclave, even the Raider tribes and the merchant guilds, they all organize themselves around the same basic assumptions about how to divide territory, how to structure authority, how to imagine political space. Those assumptions came from 1969, from a reorganization that was supposed to make America stronger, but might have just made us more uniform, more predictable, more vulnerable. If we want to build something different, something that might actually survive the next catastrophe, we need to break free from Commonwealth thinking. We need to remember that America was once 50 different experiments in self-government, 50 different approaches to the same problems, 50 different visions of what a good society could be. We consolidated all that diversity into 13 administrative blocks, and when those blocks failed, we lost all 50 alternatives at once. The question is not whether the Commonwealth system was good or bad. The question is whether we are doomed to keep replicating it because we have forgotten there were ever any other options. The question is whether my great-grandfather died defending something that could have saved us, or whether he died defending nostalgia for a system that was already obsolete. I am standing at the California-Nevada border checkpoint, the place where I found his driver's license, the place where Commonwealth boundaries used to matter. And I am looking at two paths forward. One path leads to New Vegas, to Mr. House City-State, to a vision of the future built on pre-war corporate autocracy. The other path leads into NCR territory, or what is left of it after Shady Sands fell, to a vision of the future built on Commonwealth-style democracy. Neither path remembers what it meant to be California or Nevada. Neither path values the state identities that my great-grandfather died defending. Both paths assume that regions are the natural unit of political organization, that consolidation is inevitable, that the future has to look like some version of the Commonwealth system because we literally cannot imagine anything else. But I can imagine something else. I have studied the old records I have read, the histories I have traced, the lines that the 1969 reorganization drew across America. And I know that those lines were choices, not inevitabilities. We chose centralization over diversity. We chose efficiency over resilience. We chose Commonwealth consolidation over state sovereignty. And maybe, just maybe, we can make different choices now. That is what I am trying to do, standing here at this forgotten border checkpoint with a 200-year-old driver's license in my hand. I'm trying to remember what we lost when we forgot about states, when we let Commonwealth thinking become the only way to imagine political organization. Let me tell you what I have been building. For the last year, I have been traveling to settlements across what used to be California and Nevada, talking to people about forming something new. Not a Commonwealth, not a region, not even a republic in the NCR mold. Something smaller, more local, more diverse. A confederation of independent towns and settlements, each one maintaining its own sovereignty, each one choosing how to govern itself, all of them cooperating when it makes sense, but never surrendering their autonomy to some larger administrative structure. It is slow work. People do not understand what I am talking about half the time. They have been raised on Commonwealth thinking on the assumption that you need regional consolidation to accomplish anything important. When I talk about town-level sovereignty, about keeping power local and distributed, they look at me like I am crazy. How can we defend ourselves against the Legion without a unified military, they ask? How can we trade effectively without regional economic coordination? How can we rebuild civilization without centralized planning? And I tell them the same way the original 13 colonies did it. The original 13, not the 13 Commonwealths. The 13 colonies that became the 13 states that formed a union while maintaining their sovereignty. That is the model we need to remember, the one that existed before 1969, before Commonwealth consolidation, before we decided that efficiency mattered more than diversity. But here's the thing I have learned. You cannot rebuild the past. You cannot go back to 1968 and choose differently. The America that existed before Commonwealth reorganization is gone, and it is not coming back. My great-grandfather's California, the state, with its own identity and its own power, that California died long before the bombs fell. It died in 1969 when 50 stars became 13. What we can do is learn from what we lost. We can look at how the Commonwealth system shaped the post-war world, how it created the patterns that every faction still follows, how it limited our political imagination to regional thinking. And we can choose to break those patterns, not by recreating the past, but by building something new that incorporates the lessons the past should have taught us. Diversity creates resilience. Decentralization creates adaptation. Local control creates experimentation. These are not just abstract principles, they are survival strategies. When you centralize power, you create efficient systems that fail catastrophically when the center collapses. When you distribute power, you create messy systems that survive because no single failure can take down the whole structure. The Commonwealth system was efficient. It streamlined resource management, coordinated regional responses, reduced friction between competing state governments. And when the bombs fell, all that efficiency became a liability. Regional coordination centers got vaporized, and entire Commonwealths lost the ability to function. If power had been more distributed, if every state and every town had maintained more autonomy, the collapse would have been slower, more uneven, more survivable. I have seen this principle play out in the wasteland over and over again. The settlements that survive are the ones that do not depend on anyone else, the ones that maintain their own food supplies and their own defenses and their own decision-making processes. The settlements that fail are the ones that get incorporated into larger structures that trade autonomy for security, that become dependent on regional protection or regional trade or regional governance. The NCR looked strong when it was growing, when it was incorporating more territories and building more infrastructure and projecting more power. But strength built on centralization is brittle. One bomb destroyed Shady Sands and the whole republic went into free fall. Not because the people disappeared, not because the resources vanished, but because the entire system was designed around the assumption that the center would hold. In a more distributed system, losing one city would have been a tragedy but not a catastrophe. Other cities would have continued functioning, continuing governing, continuing to cooperate without needing central coordination. But the NCR, built on Commonwealth assumptions, could not imagine functioning without a capital, without central authority, without the hierarchical structure that made it look like a pre-war government. That is the lesson I want people to understand. That is why I am standing at this border checkpoint with my great-grandfather's driver's license, trying to explain to anyone who will listen that the Commonwealth system was not just a political reorganization. It was a fundamental change in how Americans thought about power, about identity, about the relationship between local and central authority. And that change trapped us in patterns that made the post-war world more uniform, more predictable, more vulnerable than it needed to be. Let me tell you who I really am, because I have been dancing around this for long enough. My name is Sarah Chen, and I am not just a vault dweller from Vault 21. I am a former NCR Ranger, decorated veteran of the Mojave Campaign, and I fought at Hoover Dam believing I was defending democracy and civilization against Caesar's tyranny. I killed Legion soldiers. I watched my squad mates die. I believed in the Republic with every fiber of my being, and then I started asking questions, started researching, started finding documents that showed me how the NCR had replicated the Commonwealth system without even realizing it, how we had built our Republic on the same centralized assumptions that made pre-war America vulnerable, started understanding that we were repeating history because we did not know enough history to recognize the pattern. When Shady Sands fell, when the Capitol got nuked and the Republic collapsed, I was not surprised. I was devastated, but I was not surprised, because I had spent years studying how centralized systems fail, how Commonwealth thinking creates single points of catastrophic failure, how efficiency and resilience are often opposites. I knew it was coming. I just did not know when. I left the NCR after that, turned in my Ranger armor, walked away from the only life I had ever known, and started this journey. Started trying to understand what went wrong, not just with the NCR, but with the whole pattern of post-war political development. Started tracing everything back to 1969, to the decision to consolidate 50 states into 13 Commonwealths, to the moment when American diversity got sacrificed for American efficiency. And I found my great-grandfather's story. Found out that someone in my family had fought against Commonwealth consolidation, had understood what we were losing, had tried to preserve state sovereignty, even when it became politically impossible. Found out that resistance was always an option, that the path we took was not inevitable, that we could have chosen differently. That knowledge, that understanding that history was made by choices and not by fate, that is what keeps me going. That is why I am trying to build something different in the wasteland, trying to create a model of political organization that does not rely on Commonwealth assumptions, that values local autonomy over regional coordination, that chooses resilience over efficiency. It is hard work, People do not trust it. The settlements I talk to, they want security guarantees, they want trade agreements, they want all the things that regional governments promise. And I have to explain that those promises come with costs, that security purchased through dependence is fragile, that trade managed through central coordination is vulnerable, that every benefit of consolidation creates a corresponding risk. Some of them listen, some of them understand. We have got maybe a dozen settlements now that are experimenting with this model, maintaining their independence while cooperating on specific issues without creating permanent structures of regional authority. It is messy, it is inefficient. There are coordination failures and communication breakdowns and all the problems that the Commonwealth system was designed to solve. But it is also resilient. When one settlement faces a crisis, the others help without creating dependencies. When one settlement makes a mistake, the others learn without being forced to replicate that mistake. When one settlement gets destroyed, the others survive without losing their ability to function. That is what diversity looks like in practice. That is what a 50-state model, or in our case, a 50-settlement model, could accomplish. Not efficiency, not streamlined coordination, not the kind of impressive centralized power that makes empires look strong. Just survival, just adaptation, just the ability to keep going when parts of the system fail. I think about the resource wars a lot, about how America tore itself apart competing for dwindling oil supplies. In our timeline, that competition was managed at the Commonwealth level, 13 regions fighting over resources, creating buffer zones between states that might have gone to war with each other. Maybe that prevented state versus state conflicts, maybe it saved lives. But it also meant that when Commonwealth resource allocation failed, when the system could not handle the pressure anymore, the whole region collapsed at once. The Southwest Commonwealth's water wars in the 1970s did not just affect California or Nevada or Arizona individually. They affected the whole regional bloc simultaneously, creating cascading failures that accelerated the path to nuclear war. In a 50-state system, resource conflicts would have been more numerous but smaller scale. California versus Nevada over water rights, Arizona versus New Mexico over agricultural land, localized conflicts with localized solutions instead of regional crises that threatened the entire national structure. More conflicts, yes, but conflicts that could be resolved without threatening the whole system. That is the trade-off nobody wants to acknowledge. Centralization reduces the number of conflicts by consolidating power, but it increases the severity of conflicts when they happen because more is at stake. Decentralization increases the number of conflicts by distributing power, but it reduces their severity because each conflict affects fewer people and can be resolved without threatening the whole system. The Commonwealth system chose fewer bigger conflicts, and ultimately that choice led to one massive conflict that destroyed everything. A 50-state system would have chosen more smaller conflicts, and maybe, just maybe, those smaller conflicts could have been managed without ending the world. I cannot prove that. I do not have access to alternate timelines. All I have is logic history and the patterns I see in the wasteland. But those patterns suggest that the Commonwealth system made us more vulnerable, not less. That the reorganization of 1969 was a mistake, well-intentioned maybe, but a mistake nonetheless. If this confession meant something to you, leave a like. It is the only way I know you liked the video. Standing here at the border checkpoint holding my great-grandfather's driver's license, I feel the weight of all the choices that led us here. The choice in 1969 to centralize, the choice in 2077 to go to war, the choice after the bombs to rebuild using the same patterns that had failed us, and the choice I am making now to try something different to resist Commonwealth thinking, to remember that America was once diverse and distributed and resilient precisely because it was never fully unified. The future does not have to look like the past. We do not have to keep organizing ourselves into regional blocks just because that is what we inherited from the Commonwealth system. We do not have to accept that centralization is inevitable or that efficiency matters more than survival. We can choose differently. We can build something new, but only if we remember what we lost. Only if we understand how the Commonwealth system shaped us, limited us, programmed us to think in certain ways about power and identity and political organization. Only if we are willing to question the assumptions that everyone else takes for granted. That is why I am telling this story. That is why I have spent 3 years researching the Commonwealth system, mapping its effects on post-war development, tracing the lines it drew across America that we still follow 200 years later. Because someone needs to remember, someone needs to understand, someone needs to ask the question, what if America had never divided into 13 Commonwealths? What if we had stayed 50 states diverse and messy and complicated? We cannot answer that question with certainty, but we can learn from it. We can use it to imagine alternatives to build systems that do not replicate the vulnerabilities of Commonwealth centralization to create futures that are not trapped by the past. The wasteland is full of people trying to rebuild civilization. The NCR tried, the Enclave tried, the Brotherhood tries, Caesar's Legion tries. Every faction has its vision of what the future should look like, but almost all of them, whether they realize it or not, are building on Commonwealth foundations, replicating Commonwealth assumptions, making Commonwealth mistakes. I am trying to build something different, something that remembers the 50-state system, something that values diversity over uniformity, decentralization over consolidation, resilience over efficiency. It is an experiment. It might fail, probably will fail if I am being honest. The forces pushing towards centralization are strong. The habits of Commonwealth thinking are deeply ingrained. The appeal of regional power is seductive. But even if it fails, even if my confederation of independent settlements does not survive, at least I will know I tried. At least I will know I asked the questions that needed asking, challenged the assumptions that needed challenging, remembered the alternatives that everyone else forgot. My great-grandfather died defending state sovereignty in a world where states no longer mattered. I am living defending local autonomy in a world where regions seem to be the only option. Maybe we are both fools fighting for versions of America that can never exist. Or maybe we are the only ones who understand what we lost when we stopped believing in diverse, distributed, decentralized governance. The sun is setting over the wasteland now, casting long shadows across the ruins of the border checkpoint. In a few hours, I will pack up my camp and head west toward the next settlement that might be willing to listen to the next group of survivors who might be willing to try something different. It is slow work. It is hard work. But it is the only work that matters. Because if we do not break free from Commonwealth thinking, if we do not remember that there were other ways to organize America, other visions of what we could be, then we are doomed to keep repeating the same patterns. Building centralized systems that look strong but fail catastrophically, creating regional powers that dominate for a while and then collapse, consolidating authority in the name of efficiency until one bomb, one crisis, one failure destroys everything we have built. I am done accepting that future. I am done replicating Commonwealth mistakes. I am done pretending that the reorganization of 1969 was inevitable or wise or beneficial. It was a choice, and it was the wrong choice, and 200 years later, we are still paying the price. So, I am choosing differently. I am building differently. I am remembering what everyone else forgot, that America was once 50 different experiments in self-government, and that diversity was our strength, not our weakness. The Commonwealth system tried to make us uniform, tried to make us efficient, tried to make us manageable. And it succeeded, and we died. Time to try something else. Time to remember the 50 stars. Time to ask, what if America had never divided into 13 Commonwealths? What if we had stayed diverse, stayed distributed, stayed resilient? We cannot know for sure, but we can try to build that future now in the ruins of the old world with the lessons that 2 centuries of failure should have taught us. That is my confession. That is my truth. That is what I found when I picked up my great-grandfather's driver's license and realized that the America that died was more divided than the one that tried to survive. We divided ourselves the wrong way, consolidated when we should have diversified, centralized when we should have distributed. And now in the wasteland, we have a chance to correct that mistake. If we are brave enough to remember, if we are wise enough to learn, if we are strong enough to choose differently, the choice is ours. It always was. We just forgot we had it.